In Black Reconstruction, 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois stated that, quote, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back into slavery." Slavery was the first racial domain in the United States. During the era of slavery, from the 17th to the 19th centuries, most African Americans were property. Jim Crow was the second racial domain in the U.S. During the Jim Crow era, from the late 19th century to the 1960s, African Americans were second-class citizens. Today, a modern racial domain exists. Under the new Jim Crow of the late 20th century and early 21st century, many African Americans are relegated to the status of criminals. From property to second-class citizens to criminals. A racial domain is a system for reproducing white supremacy. A racial domain is a system for reproducing white supremacy. Let me briefly describe the transition from the racial domain of slavery to the racial domain of Jim Crow. Reconstruction was a brief period between slavery and Jim Crow. It was an attempt to rebuild Southern society based on the principle of black citizenship and equality. It was a short-lived experiment, and it marked the transition from one system of white supremacy, slavery, to the next system of white supremacy, Jim Crow. Reconstruction began after the end of the Civil War in 1865. Beginning in 1866, the Civil Rights Act extended citizenship rights to African Americans. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, outlawed slavery, guaranteed citizenship and equal protection for African Americans, and gave African American men the right to what? To vote. Reconstruction was a time of incredible accomplishments for African Americans. They sat on juries, they cast ballots, they helped establish public school systems, they served in Congress and held local offices, from sheriff to tax collector. They participated in politics, they created institutions, from churches to schools. But moments of rapid racial progress in the U.S. are always followed by periods of vicious backlash. Southern racists and other defenders of the status quo were determined to turn back the clock and reassert white supremacy in the South. While terrorist groups like the KKK were always opposed to black equality, members of the political and economic establishment also retreated from the principle of racial justice during the 1870s, especially as a bad economy shifted attention away from civil rights. And by the way, the same thing happened in the 1970s, and in many ways, the same thing is happening today. By the late 1870s, Reconstruction had ended throughout the South, and the white supremacist Democratic Party was again in control of Southern politics. The end of Reconstruction meant the return of officially enforced white supremacy. The failures of Reconstruction were profound. Reconstruction failed to distribute land, or redistribute land. Why did African Americans want land? Autonomy, economic autonomy, political autonomy. And a source of independence, a measure of compensation for years of stolen labor as slaves. Reconstruction failed to stamp out racial terrorism at the hands of the Klan, and it failed to provide access for African Americans to economic security. Some historians have referred to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s as a second Reconstruction, right? Why did they do that? Because the movement partially fulfilled some of the aims of the first Reconstruction in the 19th century. So one could describe the first Reconstruction as an unfinished revolution or a partially reversed revolution. And it would take the nation a century to fulfill some of Reconstruction's basic demands. Of course, many remain unfulfilled to this day. This is why we're here. Reconstruction was defeated by conservative lawmakers, wealthy financial interests, and racists who wanted to rebuild a white supremacist order. These and other groups helped create the era of Jim Crow, a period of history in which the racial system or racial domain relegated African Americans to second-class citizenship. The black historian Rickford called the onset of the Jim Crow era in the late 19th, early 20th century the nadir. What does the nadir mean? Anybody know? Right, the lowest point of black life. I believe we're in a new nadir today in many respects. African American men were violently disfranchised. They lost the right to what? To vote. This was accomplished through various schemes, including poll taxes and literacy tests. African Americans were reduced to the lowest economic rung. They were forced into peonage or debt slavery. In urban areas, the vast majority of African American women worked as domestics or washerwomen, as many as 90% in some communities. 90%. I don't want you to Google when you go home the average wealth for a black woman in the United States compared to the average wealth for a white woman in the United States. You'll see that legacy of Jim Crow. Black men performed other forms of menial labor. The Jim Crow era was profoundly violent, as we know. To ensure the total social and economic subordination of African Americans, white supremacist mobs and vigilantes would routinely harass, terrorize, rape, beat, and lynch African Americans. Lynching was a means of maintaining social control. The centerpiece of Jim Crow was the legal system of segregation, or what I call American apartheid, the American version of what later became the racist apartheid system in South Africa. The Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision of 1896 established the doctrine of separate but equal. The court ruled that racial segregation was legal so long as facilities for white and black people were equal. And as we know, this would not be the case. For example, for generations, in many southern counties simply lacked black high schools altogether. So black citizens were paid taxes for public institutions, public schools, from which they were excluded. Jim Crow was not just about separation. This is very important. I will stress this point with my students. Jim Crow is not fundamentally about separation. You have black people and white people in very close proximity throughout the Jim Crow South. Jim Crow is about subordination. It is about domination. Jim Crow laws and policies were designed to ensure that whenever African Americans and white people came into contact in the street, on the bus, in workplaces, African Americans were subordinate, subservient, and degraded. This is why Michelle Alexander refers to Jim Crow as a caste system, a system of rigid social hierarchy in which you are never able to rise above the class into which you're born, right? Like the old social caste system in India. In order to consolidate the racial caste system of Jim Crow, a racist criminal justice system was created. The 13th Amendment had outlawed involuntary servitude except for those convicted of what? A crime. The Southern white power structure used this loophole to recreate the system of slavery for black convicts who were rented out to mining companies and other businesses, and they were often worked to death. This was the profitable convict lease system. Other racist laws recreated the old post-emancipation black codes designed specifically to subordinate African Americans. So you see the kind of criminalization of black life that you see now in Ferguson. Fast forward 100 years. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s destroyed Jim Crow, the overt system of racial hierarchy, but moments of racial progress are followed by periods of vicious backlash. The new racial domain would help reverse black social, political, and economic progress of the civil rights movement, but would have to do so in the absence of a formal system of racial discrimination because the black freedom struggle and civil rights laws had dismantled Jim Crow. I have 2 more lines. The new Jim Crow, the new plan for criminalizing black life was and is mass incarceration. Like the old Jim Crow, the new system would appear natural. It would be defended as constitutional, inevitable, and just. And it would be perpetuated and reinforced by people, especially those who consider themselves liberals and who felt no particular racial animosity toward African Americans, but who practiced a vicious form of racial indifference.